Hello guys, today I want to introduce you to a new JavaScript small framework called Alpine.js. And you would think, another framework to learn? Come on, are you kidding me? But trust me, it's really small and useful. Imagine the case, you have some kind of page, like a welcome Laravel page, and you want to make something dynamic but really small, without any Vue.js or jQuery or any library. For example, you click a link and that text appears or disappears. So imagine that the link to the documentation wouldn't lead to Laravel page, but instead it would open some kind of text here. And what would you do? You probably would use something like on-click inline JavaScript or jQuery as a separate script below, so then you should load jQuery, or you would use something like Vue.js. Wouldn't it be cool to have something inside of HTML? So you write HTML and you write some kind of if statement as a parameter that it shows or hides something. So that's exactly the typical case for Alpine.js, to write dynamic JavaScript syntax inside of HTML tags. So to load that Alpine.js, and by the way, the fact that it's really small is proven that its documentation fits in README file, so there's no separate Alpine.js documentation. It's all in here in README on GitHub. So all you need to do is to add that from CDN, and I already did that in my project. Here on top you can see it's a default Laravel project homepage, so I've added that script. And then let's add, instead of Laravel docs here, instead of that link, let's change that to here, and then we do @click equals text open equals true. Now we define that text open in the block, which is probably this one, so parents block, and we do xData equals text open. By default it is false. Then we set that to true on click, and then that text should appear only if show text open equals true, or just text open. Let's try it out. Refresh the page. It's not appearing, but if I click, it does appear. The only thing missing is the hash appearing, so similar to Livewire, not sure if you're aware of that, or to Vue, there is a click prevent. So it prevents the original link from happening. So we reload the page again, and now the documentation is present. So for examples like these, Alpine.js, it's a really good, sweet, and small framework. So if you look at the documentation, the most simple examples are similar to my example, so xData and then open true false. Then there's tabs example, so you can play around with variables and their values. You can @click assign some value to some variable and then show some tab or some section depending on that variable value. And in a sense, Alpine.js is similar to Tailwind CSS in the sense that you write inline HTML. Similar to Tailwind, look at that long set of classes, but the goal is that you don't ever leave HTML. So you rarely need to go to .css file and add some styles directly. It's everything here. So similar to Alpine.js, the goal is to add dynamic behavior without leaving the HTML, without switching the workflow, and achieving the same results. Let's take a look at another example from one of our demo projects, and my colleague Carlis implemented that in both jQuery and Alpine.js, and I will show you the difference. So imagine the form where you need to enable a field whenever the checkbox is checked. So if the ingredient of meat is present, then you may enter the amount. If it's unchecked, then that field becomes disabled with no value. An implementation of that in jQuery looks something like this. So you have input with data ID, and then on click event, you play around with data ID, whether it's checked, and then you add attribute. Now look how it would look in Alpine. See, I've changed the code, so this is the old code. That section scripts is irrelevant anymore, and this is the Alpine code. xData enabled comes true or false because that form is used both in create and edit form. Then we assign the value, and then we assign X model. It's similar to wire model in Livewire. Basically, we're assigning the variable. So enabled becomes true or false depending on whether it's checked or not. And then on change, we remove the value if it was present. And then that text box, again, we assign X model value. Disabled is assigned to enabled, which is this variable. And that's it. So a few variables, a few assignments, binding, and you have the same behavior instead of having a separate script, jQuery or Vue.js or whatever. So that's another example of Alpine.js. Also, there are bigger structures like for loop, x4, so you need to have template, so some kind of block of HTML tags template, and then you can assign x4 and show every item. So in total there are 14 directives to learn, but you don't need to learn all of them. It's enough to have 3 or 4 in your arsenal. Also, there are magic properties and some more complex examples, but that's on the edge then. In my personal opinion, Alpine is great for some small changes like this one. I've showed 2 examples, but if it gets more complex, I would probably use something like Vue.js, because then it's a bigger chunk of logic and it's more readable as a separate class or component. And by the way, did I mention that Alpine.js is created by the same guy who created Laravel Livewire? So Caleb Porzio created Alpine and then tied it together with Livewire. So Livewire makes it a bit hard to interact with JS or jQuery components or JavaScript in general. So Alpine.js makes it possible. And then within Livewire, for some dynamic things in JavaScript, you don't need to actually use jQuery or Vue or JavaScript. You can use Alpine. And not only that, let's scroll down. You can interact with Livewire from Alpine with some variables that are shared. So there's a really strong connection between those two. So you cannot interact with Livewire from any JS, jQuery, or Vue.js, but Alpine allows you to do that. And there are more examples on this page, like sharing state and some more complex things. So I do advise you to think about Alpine.js. You have some small dynamic interactions on your web page. That mini framework is really popular already with 12,000 stars on GitHub, and it could be a good addition to your toolbox as a developer. And philosophically speaking, I'm not a big fan, or in fact I wasn't a big fan at the beginning of 2020 of adding more frameworks to developers' everyday life, but now in 2020 all those separate frameworks became stronger. So Livewire, Tailwind CSS, Vue.js, Alpine now. So on top of Laravel, and this channel actually is about Laravel, now we do have to learn or at least understand those frameworks. And for every project, pick the ones that we need and that suit best. And in case of Alpine, it's not a huge thing to learn. I've explained you the main stuff in just this short video. So try it out when you have time if you haven't already, and see you guys in other videos.